Christ is risen. Happy Easter. Today, Tom and I at each of our campuses are going to explore the resurrection through what it means to live with the power of the risen Christ in our lives. And we're going to get there through talking about offenses and anger, and we're going to land today on the difficult work of living out love. Throughout the message today, we'll go back and forth between Potterville, where I am now, and South Lansing, where Tom is. Think about this phrase, no offense. No offense. I'd like to think that it's tough to offend me. I like to think it's tough to anger me, and I like to think that I have a pretty thick skin. And part of having that thick skin is going through scientific training for so many years. It was part of my life for 15 years, and I've faced down dozens of my scientific colleagues in public settings where I've presented my work, and I've had my colleagues pick my work apart and criticize it in public. It's part of the scientific process, and well, you won't last long in science if you get offended by criticism of your ideas. Now, I've gotten reviews back of journal articles I've submitted where my colleagues have criticized me and criticized my work, even at one point using words I didn't understand, like prolix. I had to look it up. I bet you do too. Your hint? It's not a compliment. That criticism may have offended me a little bit. I like to think it's tough to offend me, but if someone criticizes my wife, Jana, or my kids, or betrays one of my friends, or if someone from outside our church takes verbal shots at our church, or when people discriminate against others, or when people harm someone who doesn't have the power to defend themselves, or when people are selfish to the detriment of others, well, maybe I'm getting a little worked up here. Maybe it's not so tough to offend me after all. Let me think more about that. I can't be the only one, right, who wrestles with being offended. I bet you wrestle with that too, and it's probably easier than I think to be offended. Have you noticed that there are many people today who seem to be easily offended? Have you noticed that as you look at people in our world around us? Maybe it's you that's easily offended. We live in a culture right now where we are constantly offended by something and angry. And let's be honest, there's a lot to be offended about. Now, despite my initial claims earlier about my science training, well, I do get offended. And my guess is so do you. We all experience offenses, and offenses are part of life that we must all deal with. As we go through life, we will be displeased. We will be affronted. And the question is whether we're going to stay there. Whether we're going to stay there in that state of being insulted or morally outraged. Do we stay in our anger, or do we work through our offenses toward restoration and repair? Those two big questions will guide us today when it comes to offense. And here's where I want us to land, that we will lead with love, not with anger. We will lead with love, not with anger. We're starting a new message series today on being offended, and it's called No Offense. We live in a country right now that is characterized by divisions and offenses and anger. And in this series, we're going to explore our response as disciples of Jesus to all the division and the hatred and the anger in our world. And the material we'll engage in this series, it comes from two different sources. It comes from messages from Life Church in Oklahoma, and it also comes from a book called Unoffendable by Brant Hansen. In this series, we're going to look at the dark side of anger. Now, I mentioned the dark side of anger because, well, there are two big thought streams in Christianity when it comes to thinking about anger. One thought stream, well, is that it's okay to get angry at the things that anger God. We get offended at injustice. We get offended at war. We get offended at the harm people cause to one another in our world. And we are angry and offended because these things are upsetting. They're sin. There's a righteous anger that we can have over injustice. But then there's another thought stream, and that other thought stream says that being angry is like playing with fire. And this thought stream emphasizes that there's a destructive power in anger that can cause further harm. Being offended can cause us to fight back against perceived injustice, not with love, but with violence. And I mention perceived injustice because, well, often when we get angry and offended, it's not always about true injustices. For many of us, we're angry, but we're not angry about the right things. And when we are angry about the right things, we often respond out of anger in ways that aren't loving and that cause further harm. That, my friends, that's a problem. It's the second way of Christian thinking about anger that we'll explore in this series. It's a reminder of the danger of the dark side of anger. So here's our first question for discussion today. Let's wade together into this tricky subject of anger. What do you think about anger and offense? Is it okay to be angry? And if so, when? Let's take a moment and discuss that.